Hey guys, tonight we drift far from the usual dusty ruins and broken columns. Instead, you're floating through a damp, gray fog, your little canoe slicing silently across a still lake. You can't see much yet, just silhouettes of birds and something large, bobbing gently in the distance. A raft, an island. A person with a very ambitious garden. The air smells like wet clay and crushed reeds. A paddle splashes softly. Not yours. Somewhere nearby. A dog barks, muffled by distance and morning mist. You're not on a sightseeing tour. You're about to witness one of the weirdest, most underrated feats of human engineering. And if we're being honest, you probably wouldn't survive this place without a guide. Because this is Lake Texcoco, heart of the Aztec world. And these floating gardens, they're alive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, comment below with your location and the time you're tuning in. I love seeing how far this sleepy little canoe floats. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink against the mist. There's movement ahead, a wide, green platform. Perfectly rectangular, rising out of the water like it grew there, and in a way, it did. The man standing on it barely notices you. He's busy, kneeling in the middle of the floating plot. He digs his hands into rich, black mud, then pats down rows of young maize. This is a chinampa, a floating garden. But it's not floating like a raft or a pool toy. It's stable, permanent, anchored. It defies logic. Kind of like when you see a raccoon operating a vending machine. Your canoe glides past another chinampa, then another, then dozens. A maze of green rectangles stretches as far as the eye can see, each one bordered by narrow canals, like water lanes on a checkerboard. Birds swoop overhead. Someone plays a wooden flute nearby badly, but with confidence. These aren't just gardens. This is a city made of plants. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was literally wrapped in these floating farms. And they worked. Boy, did they work? You try to wrap your head around it. This was 1325 AD, give or take a calendar mishap. No tractors, no metal tools, no wheelbarrows. And yet, somehow, the Aztecs grew enough food here to feed hundreds of thousands of people. Historians still argue whether these gardens could outproduce modern small farms. Some believe they reached yields 5 to 7 times higher per acre. Others call that number bloated, like your ego when you nail a parking job on the first try. Either way, you're witnessing the heartbeat of an empire that understood water, not as a barrier but as a secret weapon. The paddle taps your canoe again. You drift closer to a chinampa under construction. It's just a skeleton for now. Wooden stakes driven into the lake bed. Bundles of reeds stacked along the edges. Men haul in baskets of mud and compost. One yells something about the willow saplings they're planting at the corners. These trees don't just shade the crops, they'll grow roots deep into the bottom, tethering the whole structure so it doesn't float away like a regrettable online order. You reach out and touch the soil. It's warm, soft, thick, surprisingly firm for something supposedly floating. You smell decay, but the good kind. The earthy, green rot that says everything is alive. This is swamp magic. Basically, compost, river muck, straw, and time. No machines, just patience, mud, and a deep trust in gravity not to fail you. Above you, a heron glides past. Below the surface, fish flash like coins in cloudy water. The chinampa next to you glistens with dew, its rows of amaranth glowing pink under the early sun. You see beans climbing corn stalks, squash curling along the edges. Classic Three Sisters farming, only now it floats, or appears to. Here's the kicker. These gardens aren't really floating, they're semi-floating. They're built on lake shallows where stakes can be driven, and mud can mound up. Chinampas cheat the floaty aesthetic with structure. It's like a house on stilts that happens to be a salad bar. You lean back and imagine what it felt like to wake up here 600 years ago. The scent of marigolds, the sound of canoes bumping docks, the sight of volcanic peaks rising behind a horizon of plants. You wouldn't hear cars or sirens, just wind, water, and the occasional jaguar shout from someone's weird pet collection. A woman poling a canoe glides past, her boat stacked high with fresh greens, chili peppers, tomatoes, and flowers. She waves casually, as if to say, "Yes, I live in a floating city. No, I won't trade you for your sneakers." You try to respond but realize you've dozed off for a moment. The rhythmic swish of the paddle, the damp hush of morning, everything slows, even your thoughts. Somewhere behind you, someone yells in Nahuatl, the Aztec language still spoken today. They're arguing over a planting schedule. Probably, or flirting. Hard to tell. Honestly, and just like that, you're not in modern-day anything anymore. You're in a world built out of mud and genius, balancing on water, quiet as a breath. You start wondering something very reasonable, maybe even a little judgmental. Why, out of all the places on Earth, would someone choose to grow food in a swamp? It's wet. It's buggy. The ground sucks at being ground. You can't walk 2 feet without losing a sandal or your dignity. But the Aztecs, they saw Lake Texcoco and thought, yup, that's the spot. And honestly, they had their reasons. You shift your weight in the canoe, drifting slowly past chinampa after chinampa, trying to understand the logic. The lake is wide and flat, surrounded by distant mountains. The air smells like mildew and flowers' strange combo. But the water here is shallow, which makes it surprisingly cooperative if you're into things like floating gardens, strategic canoe routes, and, empire building. Back then, the Valley of Mexico was a giant basin filled with lakes, but not the fun kind. Texcoco was brackish, half salty and filled with minerals. Most crops would throw a tantrum and die. But the Aztecs figured something out. If you move close to the edges of the lake where freshwater springs trickle in and mix lake mud with clean river sediment, you get a soil that's weirdly fertile, like absurdly fertile. Like, this soil could raise a houseplant you forgot existed for 8 months fertile. And even better, no tilling required, no rocks, no stubborn roots. You basically just scoop, dump, and wait for the squash to show up. Here's the historical fact of the night. By the time the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan had somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 acres of chinampa farmland. That's not just a garden. That's an agricultural machine built out of mud pies and hope. But you don't just stumble into that kind of success. It starts with a mindset. One where land isn't something you own, it's something you build. You glide past 2 men knee-deep in sludge, scraping buckets of silt from the lake bed and dumping them into woven reed frames. They're not angry about the mud, they're thrilled. This is prime stuff. Lake Texcoco's goo was naturally packed with nutrients from fish waste, decaying plants, and volcanic minerals. Basically, nature's version of a smoothie gross, but effective. Still, even now, you can't help but wonder, why not just walk inland and farm there like everyone else? Well, everyone else was already doing that. By the time the Aztecs arrived, central Mexico was heavily populated. Most good farmland was taken, claimed, or fought over. The newcomers, originally a scrappy group of migrants with limited political clout, had to get creative. So, like any great underdog in history, they made something out of nothing, literally. They took the one thing no one wanted, a marsh, and turned it into an agricultural goldmine. Fringe scholars have even suggested that their myth of divine guidance being told to settle where an eagle perched on a cactus. Devouring a snake might have been more practical than symbolic. Maybe they were just looking for a reason to settle here. And a good PR campaign never hurts. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs invented the chinampa system entirely on their own or adapted it from earlier cultures like the Xochimilca. Some think the Toltecs or even the Maya played a role. Others say it developed independently because, frankly, when you're standing in a swamp with no land and too many mouths to feed, a floating garden starts to sound less like a dream and more like a Tuesday. Whatever the origin, the Aztecs took it to the extreme. They engineered canals between every field, ensuring steady irrigation and fast transportation. They lined planting beds with carefully spaced willows. They rotated crops with a level of precision that would make your home herb garden feel like amateur hour. And unlike dry farmers, those poor souls begging the sky for rain, chinampa farmers had near-perfect moisture control. Every plant's feet stayed wet, but not soggy, like spa day for vegetables. You watch as a woman in a wide-brimmed straw hat checks her rows of chili peppers. She hums as she goes. You don't understand the tune, but it feels like it's been sung here for centuries. Probably has. She scoops up a handful of soil, rolls it in her palm, and smiles. You notice her fingers are stained green, probably from handling episode or some other magical leaf you couldn't pronounce if your life depended on it. This isn't just farming. It's ritual. It's rhythm. It's generations learning how to read mud like a diary. You close your eyes for a moment, listen to the water lap against the canoe. Somewhere behind you, a frog belches with great drama. Ahead, a long canal stretches into the mist, vanishing where the chinampas get too dense to count. And for a brief second, the logic of it all makes perfect sense. Of course you'd farm here. The lake isn't an obstacle, it's an invitation. The mosquitoes, free protein. The mud, black gold. The isolation, security. You're not growing food on the edges of civilization. You're growing it at its core. There's a soft thunk. Your canoe bumps a dock made of woven reeds. Time to hop out. Maybe, or maybe just drift a little longer. You yawn. The lake answers back with a ripple, and somewhere deep below, the soil waits dark, rich, and absolutely certain that it knows how to grow a civilization. The next chinampa you drift toward isn't finished. It's skeletal. Just a strange shape rising out of the water, like someone halfway through making a giant garden lasagna. You blink at the floating debris. A bundle of reeds, tied tightly with fiber rope, bobs gently near the surface. Two men squat nearby on a raft, expertly weaving more reeds into a rectangle. They're making what looks like a giant basket. But this basket isn't for carrying anything. It's for becoming land. Here's where it gets beautifully weird. You're watching the birth of a chinampa. The foundation always begins with tules thick, buoyant reeds that grow wild near the lake's edge. They're cut, dried, and stacked together in layers like someone's very determined picnic mat. Then comes the framework. Wooden stakes, driven down into the shallow lake bed. They don't just float and hope. They fasten the platform in place, making sure it doesn't drift off with the next gust of wind, or worse, during a really inconvenient religious ceremony. And now comes the goo. You spot a teenage boy paddling up with buckets of lake mud, which he splashes gleefully into the reed frame like a kid making the world's most serious mud pie. The water bubbles a little as the mud settles in. Then comes the compost leftover plant bits, fish bones, charcoal, animal manure, crushed shells, a layer cake of decay, all designed to make things grow. You step lightly onto a nearby chinampa that's already been completed. It gives a little under your weight, but it holds firm. The feeling is strange, like standing on something alive. Below you is not dirt. Not exactly. It's a woven structure, breathing, soaking, holding together like it's been waiting for your footsteps all along. The sun's higher now, and steam begins to rise from the damp surface. The smell, strong, earthy, a touch swampy, like a salad left in the rain. But you're getting used to it. Fun fringe fact. Some scholars suggest chinampas weren't just used for farming. They may have been early biofilters, cleaning the water around them as plant roots absorbed excess nutrients. If true, that makes this not just ancient agriculture, but eco-engineering centuries ahead of its time. You lean down and press your palm against the mud. It's warm, spongy, alive. Underneath is a tightly woven bed of reeds, now firmly packed with silt. But how do they stop it all from just washing away? Well, here's the secret sauce. Willow trees. At each corner of the chinampa, young willow saplings are planted. These aren't decorative. Their roots grow fast and deep, anchoring the whole structure like nature's rebar. Over time, those roots knit the mud, reeds, and compost into a tight, almost permanent mass. The result? A floating rectangle that doesn't go anywhere. Even when the wind throws a tantrum, you squint at one of the willows nearby. It's got ribbons tied around the trunk. Little offerings maybe for a good harvest, or maybe just because humans can't resist decorating trees. Either way, the symbolism's clear. The tree is part of the land now. And the land, it's man-made. But it behaves like nature. And yet, even here in the middle of a lake, with mud up to your ankles and frogs conducting a full-blown opera nearby, there's structure, order, a blueprint. You realize you're not looking at random floating farms. You're looking at a planned network. The chinampas are laid out with math-level precision, aligned with the sun, the winds, and access to canals. They're long and narrow, often about 10 feet wide, and up to 300 feet long, designed for efficient irrigation, easy crop rotation, and smooth canoe traffic. Historians still argue whether chinampa construction was centrally managed by the Aztec state or handled by individual families. Some believe nobles controlled the best plots. Others say it was more communal. What's clear is that the entire system operated with clockwork cooperation, because if one chinampa failed, water levels and crop cycles could go off for dozens around it. There's a shout behind you. A boy has slipped off a raft and landed with a muddy splash. Laughter erupts from the other farmers. He stands up, soaked and grinning, holding a fish in each hand like some accidental lake god. You grin too. This isn't just farming. This is a culture that plays in the mud because the mud is sacred. You move on, following the canal between chinampas. The water is dark but clear enough to see schools of tiny fish zipping between roots. Egrets stalk silently along the edges, waiting for lunch to get careless. A dragonfly the size of a paperclip buzzes your ear, then decides you're not interesting enough. You exhale slowly. This process, the building of a chinampa, it's not fast. It takes weeks, sometimes months, of layering, planting, waiting, but once it's done, that garden could last hundreds of years. Some chinampas still in use today are believed to date back to pre-Columbian times. That's like inheriting your grandma's couch and finding out it still grows corn. You settle back in the canoe again, watching as a family finishes packing another reed frame with mud. A girl carefully places the first seedlings into the dark soil, her fingers delicate, reverent. You wonder how many generations have stood in that exact spot, planting food with the same motion, under the same sky. You're drifting again, slow, steady, quiet. The water barely ripples as your canoe nudges forward through a channel narrow enough to touch the banks on either side. Except the banks aren't land. They're the edges of chinampas. Lush, ice, damp, and strangely organized, like someone tried to cross a garden center with a Venice daydream. And then you notice something odd. These gardens aren't floating away. You pause, glance at one corner of a chinampa. There it is again, a slim willow tree, about as thick as your arm, its roots sliding straight down into the water like a polite anchor. You've seen dozens already. You just didn't connect the dots. This is how they did it. How they kept thousands of semi-floating islands in place, side by side, year after year, rain after rain. The trees weren't just decoration or shade. They were anchors, sentinels, organic stakes that grab the lake bed and never let go. You glide closer to a tree growing at the exact corner of a rectangular plot. You count your strokes. Another tree, same position on the next chinampa. And the next, it hits you. They planted these trees with intention. Geometry, not randomness. The layout is deliberate. The willows form a grid so subtle you could miss it if you weren't looking from above, or if, like you're half asleep and distracted by a particularly judgmental duck. Willow trees were the go-to for several reasons. Fast-growing, strong-rooted, flexible. Their roots love water. Their bark had medicinal uses, and their presence gave the chinampa edges strength, both structural and spiritual. Fun fringe theory time. Some believe the willows were also seen as guardians, channeling the power of Tlaloc, the rain god. Whether or not that's true, one thing's for sure, planting them was genius. A live tree doesn't rot or snap in storms like a wooden stake might. And since the chinampa builders used living architecture, their gardens became a part of the lake's ecosystem, not just something placed on top of it. The trees stand patient, watching the seasons move. You pass one that's been tied with colored cords, yellow, blue, red, offerings. It's unclear if they're to the tree or through it to something watching beyond. You suddenly feel like you're inside someone's living calendar, drifting between time markers, season keepers, organic cornerstones. Beneath you, the water ripples with soft fish traffic. The roots of the willows reach down like veins, curling deep, drawing nutrients, holding tight. Above, the branches sway gently, giving just enough shade to keep moisture in the soil without choking out the sun. You imagine how it began. A farmer with mud up to his calves, jamming down a sapling at each corner, knowing it'll outlive him, knowing the roots will hold long after he's ashen memory. It's the kind of long game most modern gardeners would call unrealistic. The Aztecs called it normal. You drift past another chinampa, this one completely ringed with trees, a full square of green. The crops inside tomatoes and beans look smug and well-defended. The willow walls break the wind, block erosion, and provide natural habitat for birds and insects. It's a win-win. Or maybe a win-win-win if you count the fact that it also looks ridiculously picturesque. But it's not all romantic. You catch sight of a few willows that didn't make it leaning sideways, roots exposed, toppled into the canal. Dead trees mean unmoored corners. Unmoored corners mean erosion, and erosion means lost crops, collapsing edges, and whole chinampas becoming unstable. So the Aztecs managed the trees carefully. They pruned, they replanted, they replaced dead saplings as needed. It wasn't glamorous work. No epic poems were written about chinampa maintenance crews, but these silent caretakers were just as crucial to empire building as warriors or priests, maybe more so. You can't conquer on an empty stomach. Historians still debate whether the willow layout was a universal rule or more of a regional trend. Some say it varied by lake zone. Others argue it depended on who owned the chinampa. Commoner plots might have fewer trees, noble estates more. What's clear is that without those trees, everything else would unravel. Quite literally. A light breeze kicks up. The willow branches above you stir, brushing each other in a soft, hushing rhythm. It's the sound of leaves keeping secrets. You lean back and close your eyes for a second. When you open them, you realize the pattern stretches on and on, miles of chinampas. Everyone hugged by trees, every corner marked. It's like the farmers left behind a silent map, a blueprint made of bark and leaves and quiet trust that future generations would understand what they were seeing. And maybe that's what you're feeling now. The gentle pull of something that was never drawn on parchment, never carved in stone, but planted, alive, and growing. Somewhere behind you, a willow creaks, another boat glides past, and you catch the eye of a boy holding a basket of peppers. He nods once, then disappears around a bend. The roots hold. The garden floats. The trees remember. You paddle gently, barely disturbing the water's mirrored surface around you. The world divides neatly into two layers above. Rows of crops stretch into the morning sun. Below, their reflections waver like sleepy echoes. You're floating through a city of green geometry, yet there's no gridlock, just calm movement. Canoes glide silently past each other like courteous ghosts. Welcome to rush hour on the Chinampas. Despite the eerie stillness, this place is bustling, just not loudly. You pass one canoe stacked with bright orange marigolds, another packed with squash, and a third balancing a clay pot and a very annoyed chicken. A young woman rows past with calloused hands and a face streaked with sweat and soil. She doesn't look up. She doesn't need to. She knows every inch of this canal by muscle memory. Here's something that'll make your brain do a somersault. This wasn't just farmland. This was an agricultural metropolis built directly into a transportation network. Everything moved by water. Not roads, not carts. Just shallow canals and canoes, because why lift a heavy load when you can float it? Each chinampa was bordered by canals wide enough for a single canoe, with cross paths like streets and intersections. You're basically drifting through the Aztec version of downtown with no horns, no fumes, and the occasional heron judging you from a log. The canals made it ridiculously efficient to transport crops, tools, building materials, and gossip. If you were harvesting corn, you didn't haul it across dry land. You loaded it into your canoe, rode to the central market in Tenochtitlan, and still made it home before lunch. A mainstream historical nugget for you. Tenochtitlan, in its peak, had over 200,000 residents, possibly more. That made it one of the largest cities in the world at the time, larger than London, Paris, or Rome, and it was being fed largely by these chinampas. A few square miles of lake gardens were keeping an empire upright. The canals were more than practical. They were intentional, built with logic, dredged by hand, reinforced with clay and reeds. This wasn't lazy flooding, it was water architecture. The Aztecs engineered these lanes to keep water flowing without washing away their soil. And they kept things moving smoothly. You pass a canal intersection and nearly collide with a canoe ferrying 4 giggling children and a tired-looking dog. They steer around you without a word. The kids point at something in the water. A turtle, maybe, or a discarded sandal with its own tragic backstory. The coordination here is mind-blowing. No traffic lights, no signs, just years of inherited instinct. People here grew up navigating these canals the way you might navigate a kitchen in the dark. There's no confusion, no yelling, just paddles dipping in rhythm, like a conversation no one needs to speak aloud. You pull up next to a chinampa that looks almost decorative. Instead of crops, it's bursting with flowers, vivid reds, yellows, purples. A few bees buzz lazily from bloom to bloom. A man in a straw hat crouches in the middle, trimming stems and bundling them neatly with twine. You realize with a jolt that this chinampa is a florist's garden. Turns out, not all floating farms were for food. Some were for flowers used in rituals, markets, offerings, or just because they were beautiful. This was a society that didn't see practical and aesthetic as opposites. A well-run chinampa was expected to produce and please. And while we're here, fun fringe fact. Some chinampas even grew medicinal herbs. Plants like epazote, used for digestion, and tlapatay, an early anesthetic, were cultivated in small quantities and bartered by canoe. You could literally paddle down the canal and buy pain relief from someone's backyard pharmacy. Who needs CVS? The design of the chinampas supported it all. Their long, narrow shape wasn't random. It allowed easy access from both sides by canoe, made planting more manageable, and minimized water evaporation. The spacing of the canals also ensured consistent water flow to prevent stagnation. A thoughtful balance between irrigation and drainage. Nothing here is accidental. Historians still debate whether there was a formal irrigation authority managing the flow of water into and out of the chinampa zone. Some think city officials monitored water levels and assigned cleaning crews. Others say it was done informally, with neighborhood coordination. Either way, the result was an elegantly low-tech system that ran for centuries with barely a hiccup. As you drift farther, the chinampas begin to vary. One is clearly a seed nursery. Tiny green sprouts spaced like soldiers. Another seems to be a compost bed, covered in dark leaves and rotting vegetables. No waste here, just cycles. Decay feeding growth, growth feeding mouths, mouths feeding energy back into the work. You close your eyes for a moment and let the sounds carry you. The splash of a paddle, a distant hawk cry, the slap of fish on water, the low hum of life happening in slow motion. And when you open them again, you're passing an older man repairing the edge of his chinampa with fresh reeds. He works silently, hands fast and steady, weaving with a rhythm that says he's done this since childhood. Maybe longer, maybe forever. You realize something. This place doesn't just function, it flows. Like the water itself, like the sun across the planting rows. Like you, drifting in silence. Part of a living system designed for balance. And you start to wonder, how many modern cities can say the same? You pull your canoe up alongside a chinampa that smells like the inside of a fish tank. Not the clean kind either. The real kind, murky, mucky, and just a little too alive. You wrinkle your nose. But the farmer ahead of you doesn't flinch. He kneels at the water's edge, elbow deep in what looks like black pudding. He grins, scoops some into a wide basket, and slops it proudly onto his garden bed. You watch it ooze. And then you realize, this is the secret ingredient, lake sludge. Rich, foul, glorious sludge from the bottom of Lake Texcoco. A mix of silt, decaying plants, fish droppings, and who knows what else. This gunk was the engine that kept Aztec agriculture booming. Where others saw a swamp, the Aztecs saw a never-ending fertilizer machine. You crouch near the edge and run your fingers through the muck. It's silky, smooth, and dense, like cake batter. If cake batter had a complicated personal life, it smells like life and death mashed together, which, let's be honest, is kind of the point of fertilizer. This wasn't just dumped randomly. The sludge was collected from deep dredging canals, then carried basket after back-breaking basket to the tops of the chinampas. There, it was spread in layers and mixed with compost, corn husks, weeds, ash, animal waste. Basically, everything that could rot did. This is how the Aztecs built soil, in the middle of a lake, in a place with no real land. They didn't just farm what was already there, they invented the ground before they planted in it. One scholar once described chinampas as soil on demand, which is both accurate and sounds like a niche startup idea. But it worked. This muck was alive. It fed the plants, replenished nutrients, and created a self-renewing loop that rarely needed fallow time. Mainstream fact of the night. Aztec chinampas were so productive, they could yield 4 to 7 harvests per year depending on the crop. Compare that to most modern farms that average 1 or 2, and you start to understand why the Spanish were both dazzled and extremely uncomfortable when they saw it. You glance at the garden rows. Corn's already knee-high. Beans wrap lazily around the stalks. Marigolds bloom at the borders, bright orange like 1,000 tiny suns. Every row is perfectly spaced, every bed evenly mounded. There's no randomness here, only muscle memory passed down through generations. And the sludge keeps coming. A younger man now joins the first farmer, hauling another full basket of black muck. He dumps it beside a mound of chili plants, pats it down, and nods in satisfaction. No machines, no tractors, just human grit and lake goo. You notice something else. There's no irrigation system, no pumps, no pipes, no buckets swinging on poles, because they don't need it. The chinampa edges are porous. Water seeps up naturally. The crops sip from below. It's like hydroponics with extra mud. You dip your hand into the canal again. The water's cool and brown, flecked with duckweed. A fat fish bumps your knuckles and disappears with a wet flick. It's all connected soil to water, water to plant, plant to stomach. The ecosystem isn't just stable, it's symbiotic. Fringe theory time. Some researchers believe the Aztecs may have used aquatic companion planting, deliberately encouraging fish to live near chinampas, because their waste would add nutrients to the water. Was it planned? Maybe. Was it smart either way? Absolutely. A boy nearby pulls up a trap filled with tiny fish, possibly axolotls, those weird little salamander fish hybrids that never grow up. He dumps a few back into the water. The rest, he guts, dries, and later probably eats. Welcome to the Circle of Life Swamp Edition. Historians still debate whether chinampas were sustainable long-term without constant dredging. Some argue the canals silted up quickly, forcing farmers to keep excavating year-round. Others say the system balanced itself unless humans got greedy. As with most things, the answer's probably it depends, which is historian code for please don't email me about this again. Your canoe nudges along the side of another chinampa. This one clearly is the middle of a soil refresh. A crew of 3 is dumping alternating layers. Lake mud, then straw, then ash, then more mud. You watch as it builds inch by inch into a new planting bed. No rush, no panic, just rhythm. You're starting to feel it too, that rhythm. The slow, repetitive logic of a world that measures time in harvests and paddle strokes. You let the boat drift a bit more. Somewhere behind you, a waterbird squawks like it lost a bet. Somewhere ahead, someone's singing in Nahuatl. The words low and stretchy like they're meant to bend with the wind. And beneath you, always, the mud. It's not glamorous. It's not poetic. But it works. And in this place, that's enough. You close your eyes for a moment, half listening to the slap of wet soil against wood. It's strangely soothing, like the lake itself is breathing through its gardens. And with each breath, something grows. You lean back, the sun warm on your eyelids. As your canoe rocks gently cradled by the canal like a spoon in a soup bowl, your fingers trail through the water, lazy and slow, until you glide up to a chinampa that looks different. This one's not just soil and crops. There's a faint smell of roasted maize. A string of colored fabric flaps between 2 poles. And someone, somewhere, is badly playing a wind instrument that might once have been a flute. You're not floating past a farm right now. You're floating past a neighborhood. You blink and look again. Yep, that's a small shrine at the edge of the garden. And next to it, a raised wooden platform with kids sitting cross-legged, repeating words after a woman holding a long reed stick. You just drifted into a floating classroom. Turns out, chinampas weren't just about agriculture. In some areas, especially closer to Tenochtitlan, they were built for multi-use living. You had gardens, yes, but also temples, schools, herbalist stations, and even markets all built on platforms anchored to the lakebed like the chinampas. And that makes sense. If land is limited and building outward is hard, you build on water. Smart, right? Until you remember, they did this without metal tools, engines, or concrete. Just mud, trees, reeds, and stubborn brilliance. You pass a young couple carrying a basket between them. It's filled with tamales wrapped in banana leaves and steam still curling from the top. They smile as they pass, busy, focused, like they've done this every morning since birth. At the next bend, you hear laughter. Lots of it. You float past a chinampa where a few families have gathered. Someone's cooking over a fire pit. Yes, on the chinampa, and the smell hits you like a hug corn. Chili, maybe beans. Someone's strumming a stringed instrument. A child runs by chasing a dog that's absolutely not interested in being chased. This isn't a special occasion. This is just Thursday, a mainstream historical fact to chew on with your imaginary tamale. The Aztecs practiced calpuli, a system of extended family groups that shared responsibilities like farming, education, and ritual. Chinampas often belonged to calpuli collectives, not individuals. So work and celebration both happened communally. And on some days, it just looked like this. Kids splashing water, elders telling stories, someone yelling because they burned the squash again, and a slow, soft sense of life carrying on, floating, but grounded. You notice another structure in the distance, tall and slender, like a platform on stilts. On top sits what looks like an altar, lined with marigolds and feathers, an offering to the gods, possibly to Tlaloc, god of rain, or Xochipilli, god of flowers, art, and feasts. You're not sure. But the placement at the edge of the chinampa says it's meant to be seen from the water. The Aztecs believed lakes were sacred, filled with spirits and memories. So it makes sense their rituals didn't just include water, they were built on it. Like, if you want your message heard, you whisper it directly into the ripple. Fringe tidbit for the night. Some modern researchers have found evidence that the chinampas themselves may have been ritualized. Certain construction techniques mirrored temple layouts. Some planting patterns aligned with celestial events. Was it accidental symmetry? Historians still argue whether the Aztecs spiritualized the chinampa, or if practical and sacred were just never that separate to begin with. You pass a chinampa where herbs grow in tightly grouped circles. A woman crouches nearby, crushing something with a stone pestle, medicinal preparation. Probably, she glances at you and nods a quiet nod that says, "You're welcome to watch, but don't ask questions you aren't ready to understand." Then, a bell, a single, sharp chime from another platform. You follow the sound and find a market, tiny but real. Canoes are docked on every side of a wide, flattened chinampa. People barter from boat to boat. You spot baskets of tomatoes, dried fish, bright red chilies, and tiny clay pots. No coins, no receipts, just hands exchanging things with soft grunts of approval. It's bizarrely efficient. And you start to understand the chinampa wasn't just an innovation in farming. It was an innovation in living. A mobile, floating, modular life system. Need a garden? Build it. Need a shrine? Add it. Need a classroom? Carve out space between the squash rows and keep your voice steady. It's the Lego set of civilization only. It grows food and prays for rain. And through it all, canoes drift by like whispers. No rush, no honking. Just the soft splash of paddles and the occasional dog barking from a raft. You close your eyes again. The warmth of sun on your cheeks, the scent of roasted corn, the faint rhythm of drums in the distance. Everything here is floating. Everything here is connected. And everything here is still moving, even if nobody seems in a hurry. The chinampa breathes. The lake listens. And you're exactly where you need to be. Your canoe glides into a canal wider than most. The sun is higher now, dappling the water with dancing reflections as you approach a chinampa that seems unusually festive. You hear laughter before you see the source. Then music, flutes, drums, and the sharp clack of woodblocks. You round a bend and blink at a scene that feels like it was designed to mess with your sense of time. It's a floating party. You've drifted into Xochimilco, the Chinampa district that never quite gave up on the good times. Even in ancient days, this place was different. A little looser, a little louder, and very much alive. On this chinampa, dozens of people are gathered. There's dancing bare feet kicking up flecks of mud. There's feasting maize tamales stacked high on clay plates, bowls of amaranth and chilies passed from hand to hand, and flowers. So many flowers. It's like someone challenged the garden to a duel and the garden won. You spot garlands of marigolds draped from willow to willow, petals floating in the water like tiny boats. A woman with painted cheeks adjusts her headdress, feathers, shells, and what might be a dried lizard tied in for good luck. A boy chases a turkey through the squash vines, shrieking with glee. The turkey looks less amused. This isn't a festival once a year. This is how things are. In Xochimilco, chinampas weren't just used for farming. They became places for community events, weddings, naming ceremonies, feasts, storytelling nights, and probably a few heated chili eating contests. Mainstream historical fact: Aztec society revolved around the Tonalpohualli, a 260-day ritual calendar. Many and religious events and public celebrations were timed by it. And chinampas, always close to the people, became natural stages for these ceremonies. You watch as a priest, or maybe just an especially confident uncle, raises a clay cup and pours a splash of pulque, a fermented Maggi drink, onto the ground in offering. The earth here is floating, yes, but the ritual still counts. The gods aren't picky about foundations. And you start to understand, when the land is this alive, it becomes more than just a platform. It becomes a participant. Some fringe theories even suggest that Xochimilco chinampas were used for ceremonial theater, with floating audiences arriving by canoe to watch dramas unfold, complete with masks, singing, and maybe some accidental paddling collisions mid-tragedy. No one's entirely sure, but the idea of waterborne theater sounds exactly unhinged enough to be true. You pass a cluster of chinampas, where musicians sit on upturned baskets. Their instruments rattles, drums. Bone flutes produce a rhythm that syncs perfectly with the paddle strokes of nearby canoes. No conductor, just shared breath. And the flowers, always the flowers. In Aztec culture, flowers weren't just decoration. They symbolized divine beauty and were essential to everything from poetry to warfare. Yes, warfare. Because if you can't terrify your enemies, you might as well confuse them with a stunning floral arrangement. The term flower wars wasn't metaphorical. These were real military skirmishes, often staged to capture prisoners for sacrifice. But the flower part also reflected the deep connection between combat, ritual, and nature, life and death, blooming side by side. Back on land, or, well, mud, you watch a girl carefully place dahlias along the edge of a planting bed. Not for sale, not for food, just because they're beautiful, and because her grandmother once said the gods walk near where the brightest colors bloom. Historians still argue whether the chinampas of Xochimilco were deliberately preserved for celebration, or if they just evolved that way over time. Some think the region's unique spring-fed water gave it richer soil and more resilient crops, allowing farmers more leisure. Others say it's the people who made the space festive, not the land itself. You're leaning toward both. You float a little farther, toward the quieter edge of the celebration. A man sits alone, sketching glyphs into a bark paper scroll. His lips move silently, maybe reciting a poem, maybe muttering about how someone messed up the tamales again. You drift past without disturbing him. This, too, is part of the chinampa rhythm. Not everything here is loud. Some things grow best in silence. You glance back at the party, at the music, the children. The food passed from one muddy hand to another. It's messy, chaotic, alive, and entirely balanced. These people didn't just work the land. They lived with it. They danced on it. They sang across it. They told stories into the wind and trusted the trees to carry them forward. And you're still drifting. The beat of the drum now syncing with your breath. Your heartbeat. The hush of your paddle slicing water. This garden doesn't just grow food. It grows people. It grows memory. It grows a kind of joy that sticks to your skin like pollen. You breathe in and keep floating. It's quieter now. You've drifted past the songs and laughter into a more remote corner of the Chinampa network. The air smells of wet wood and green stems. A light breeze combs the surface of the canal, and the only sounds are the creak of your canoe and a far-off splash, probably a heron misjudging its landing. But something feels alert, coiled, like the soil here isn't just growing vegetables, it's preparing. You stop near a larger chinampa, its edges carefully fortified with thick willow roots and stone baskets. You see no party here, no children or songs, just rows of maize-tall, golden, silent. You run your fingers along a stalk. It's firm, ready. Then you notice the perimeter. Squash vines growing in tight spirals, bean plants snaking up each cornstalk, flowers planted at precise corners. This isn't just a garden, it's a strategy. You've arrived at the military side of Chinampa life. Sounds absurd, right? Floating gardens and war don't exactly belong in the same sentence. But if you were an Aztec general preparing to outlast a siege, these calm canals became your secret weapon. Mainstream historical fact. In 1521, when Hernán Cortés and his army besieged Tenochtitlan, it wasn't the walls that gave the city strength. It was the food supply. The chinampas kept producing, even under siege, even when surrounded. As long as canoes could reach the city, people could eat. And starving an empire proved much harder when its gardens floated in all directions. Aztec engineers designed the chinampa zones with redundancy in mind. Interconnected canals meant that if one area flooded, another could still deliver food. Canoes weren't just for trade and gossip. They were food convoys, medical transport, and supply runners during wartime. You squint into the distance. There, in the shade of a willow grove, a group of men are pulling up fish traps, still working, still feeding, even now, as if nothing ever truly stopped growing here. Not even for war. A fringe theory floats across your mind. Some researchers argue that chinampas were weaponized infrastructure, that by decentralizing food production across a lake, the Aztecs created an empire that couldn't easily be starved or blockaded. It's a system designed not just to nourish but to resist, and it worked. Until it didn't. You lean back in your canoe and close your eyes, imagining the canals during those final days of siege, canoes darting through torchlit water, silent paddles slicing past burning chinampas, people whispering prayers into mud-stained hands. The gardens still grew, but fewer made it home to eat. Historians still argue whether the Spanish victory came from brute force or from smallpox and betrayal. What's certain is this: the chinampas didn't give up. Even when cities fell, the garden stayed rooted. You paddle onward and notice subtle patterns in how the beds are arranged. Each section has a crop combination that seems almost coded. Maize beside beans, chilies beside amaranth, flowers marking each end. It's more than farming. It is layered planning. Nutrients are cycled. Pest control is natural, and every square foot is weaponized fertility. You see now how chinampas were the engine behind the empire. Not the warriors, not the gold, not the temples, but the plants, growing quietly while everyone else made noise. You drift past a chinampa, where old stone tools sit beside rows of onions. There's a broken blade half buried in mud, maybe forgotten, maybe left on purpose. A marker of something. You don't ask. The garden has already answered in roots and leaves. A boy in a canoe paddles by, hauling maize husks. He barely glances at you, too focused on his task. And that's the final piece of the puzzle, isn't it? The strength of the chinampa wasn't just in the soil. It was in the people who kept showing up, hauling, planting, dredging. Even when the world burned around in them, you trail your fingers through the water again. Slower this time. The sun is high now, casting sharp shadows through the beanstalks. Somewhere behind you, a bird calls out 3 short notes, then silence. And in that silence, the truth sits heavy. This wasn't just agriculture. It was resistance disguised as routine. You smile, because that feels strangely familiar, doesn't it? Fighting back not with swords or shouts, but with careful rows, rotating crops, and a calendar only the mud remembers. The air changes again, warmer, thicker, with the kind of slow stillness that makes your skin tingle. You trail your paddle across the surface, cutting a soft V through the water around you. The chinampas stretch on, row after row, but something's different here. You spot it just ahead, a half-submerged log resting beside a canal. Except the log blinks. You freeze mid-stroke. That's not a log, that's a crocodile. It doesn't move, just stares with one eye above water. Its tail draped casually across the canal bank like it owns the place. And maybe it does, because here in the Chinampa zones, you're not the only one who likes calm, nutrient-rich water. Welcome to the wild side of Aztec farming. You steer quietly around the creature, heart thudding, pretending you're not delicious. The croc watches you pass, then disappears with a low ripple, sliding under the surface like a bad thought. You exhale very, very slowly. This section of the Chinampas is less cultivated. Overgrown edges, reeds poking out like bad haircuts, vines curling into the canal. These gardens are still alive, but they're a little wilder, a little less maintained. And that brings up a question you hadn't thought to ask. How do the Aztecs protect all this? Because when your farmland floats, it's vulnerable to storms, to animals, to theft, to the occasional crocodile declaring squatters' rights. So, how did farmers make sure their hard work didn't just float away or get eaten? Turns out, they had a few tricks up their muddy sleeves. Mainstream historical fact. Chinampas were often built in clusters, shared by families or kalpuli, those extended neighborhood kin groups. These weren't just economic units, they were watchdog networks. If you messed with someone's chinampa, chances are their cousin's cousin would hear about it before you even made it back to your canoe. There was no formal chinampa police, but social enforcement was strong. People didn't just live off these gardens, they lived among them. And nobody wanted to be the one who messed up the bean harvest and got side-eyed at the next temple festival. You pass a chinampa edge reinforced with bundled reeds and stone-filled cages. It's a little fortress. You imagine someone piling it up after a storm, grumbling about the last time the current tried to steal their onions. But it wasn't just the edges that needed protection. The crops themselves were precious. Aztec farmers planted clover, chili peppers, and marigolds near the borders weren't just pretty, they helped repel pests. Certain herbs discouraged insects. Some even doubled as medicine and natural fertilizer. A chinampa was part garden, part pharmacy, part security system. A fringe theory suggests that some chinampa farmers bred guard birds, aggressive species trained to squawk and dive bomb anything unfamiliar. Whether it worked or just annoyed the neighbors is still up for debate. But you can imagine the chaos. Thieves sneaking in at night, only to be mobbed by enraged herons. Still, not every threat came with teeth or feathers. Flooding was constant. The lakes rose and fell with the seasons, and one bad rainstorm could wash out an entire planting bed. So the Aztecs built drainage canals, side trenches that acted like pressure release valves. They elevated their planting beds above typical floodlines. They layered their soil to resist erosion. And when it really mattered, they took the ultimate precaution. They dug deep. Literally, some chinampas were built with multiple layers of woven reeds and clay, forming barriers that stabilized them even when the water surged. It was messy. It was labor-intensive. But it worked. You're drifting above one now, and the roots below are so thick, they look like woven baskets turned inside out. Historians still argue whether chinampa insurance, yes, actual agricultural risk management existed. Some claim temple taxes served as a communal backup fund for crop loss. Others suggest wealthier kalpuli absorbed losses for poorer ones. Whatever the case, the gardens kept producing, year after year, even after storms, even after thieves, even after crocodiles casually dropped by for sunbathing. You glance back at the canal. The croc is gone now. In its place, a turtle suns itself on the same log, like the lake pressed a reset button. You smile. This place doesn't stay rattled for long. Up ahead, a man repairs a broken canal wall using hand-woven reed mats and buckets of silt. He works calmly, humming. He doesn't rush. The lake will wait. The crops will return. This isn't panic, it's maintenance. The unglamorous work that keeps the world afloat. You float past slowly, careful not to splash. On the next chinampa, you see stakes. driven into the soil new saplings ready to become tomorrow's tree anchors. A living fence. A promise that this floating rectangle will still be here long after its builder is bones and story. Because that's the real protection plan. Not fences, not traps, not guard birds. Continuity. Generations keeping it going. Mud after mud, root after root. Teaching the next kid how to tie the reeds just right so they don't come undone in the spring rains. The world may shift, the empire may fall, but if you build it deep enough, if you tether it right, the garden holds, and you keep floating. The air is still now quiet in that expectant way, like the lake is holding its breath. You pass a chinampa where the corn has been harvested, the stalks cut low and bundled. A single canoe drifts ahead, unmanned, tied lazily to a willow stake. No birds sing. Even the water seems subdued. You've arrived in the off-season, or maybe something deeper, a shift. Because here, among the half-empty plots and stacked-up reed mats, you begin to see the other side of all this beauty. What happens when the garden breaks down? You drift slowly past a chinampa, where one edge has collapsed. Mud and straw slump into the canal. Roots dangle like snapped cables. It's not destroyed, just wounded. And you get the strange sensation that the land itself is tired. The Aztecs built these gardens to last, but even mud has its limits. This was never a static system. The chinampa network required constant maintenance, dredging canals, replacing tree anchors, rebuilding collapsed edges. Farmers had to work year-round. Even when no crops were in season, resting meant losing ground. Literally, mainstream historical fact. By the time of the Spanish arrival in the early 16th century, the lakes of the Valley of Mexico were already under pressure. Increased urbanization, growing populations, and extended agricultural demands meant that canals were clogging faster than they could be cleared. Silt buildup made some areas unusable. Saltwater from Lake Texcoco's center began to seep into freshwater zones. Even a genius system can choke on its own success. You pass a canal that's nearly impassable, clogged with reeds, algae, floating debris. Your canoe scrapes bottom. You have to push with your paddle just to keep moving. It wasn't just nature, either. Aztec politics could be just as tangled as their roots. In the late empire, noble families began acquiring larger and more fertile chinampas. Smaller calpulli lost access. Local water routes were diverted for elite estates. Some chinampas were even taxed out of existence. Historians still argue whether this was a cause or a symptom of the Aztec Empire's decline. Some say it was environmental overreach. Others point to economic centralization, where the state became too dependent on tribute and overtaxed the system. Whatever the reason, the signs were there: overgrown canals, collapsing beds, salt poisoning the roots of once flourishing maize. And when climate shifted, the cracks widened. A fringe theory, though, gaining traction, suggests that a series of droughts in the late 1400s destabilized chinampa production. With less fresh water flowing from springs, salt from Texcoco crept inward, ruining previously fertile plots. Crops failed, farmers moved. The system unraveled from the outside in. You see it in the mud now, a bed half reclaimed by lake water, vines growing wild where rows used to be, a crumbling willow stump where a proud anchor once stood. Still, some tried to fight back. You pass a chinampa reinforced with stone terraces, an unusual method borrowed from highland farming. Someone here tried to hold the water out. Maybe it worked for a while, maybe it didn't, but it's still here. Half intact, half hoping. And now comes the real tragedy. Because when the Spanish arrived, they didn't see innovation. They saw mud. They drained the lakes, cut new canals, drying the very lifeblood of the system. What they couldn't understand, they destroyed. And what they could understand, they paved over. You drift into an area that feels almost abandoned. Weeds grow high. The air is sour. This was once a chinampa, but now it's a ghost bed. A reminder that even floating systems can sink. And yet, on the far edge of this forgotten zone, you spot a green patch. Small, barely alive, but unmistakable. Someone planted here recently. A handful of chili plants. A row of beans, maybe just enough to feed one family. Because even when the lakes dried, even when the canals clogged, even when the empire collapsed and the world reshaped itself with fire and steel, someone kept planting. You breathe in, the air thick with memory and marsh. This wasn't just a system. It was a rhythm, and rhythms don't vanish. They fade. They rest. Then, sometimes, they return. The water feels shallower now. Your paddle scrapes bottom more often. You drift past chinampas that look not ruined, but altered flatter. Wider, the edges squared off like someone took a ruler to the mud, and then it hits you. These aren't chinampas anymore. They're fields, drained, flattened, reshaped by a new kind of hand. You've arrived in the aftermath. It's the early 1500s now, or rather, it was. The Spanish are here and they're doing what colonizers do best, misunderstanding brilliance and rearranging it until it looks like something they recognize. You pull up alongside what was once a thriving garden bed. The trees are gone. The canals are dry. The soil looks cracked, dusty, sun-beaten, and at the far end of the field, a man in unfamiliar clothes is hacking at the ground with an iron hoe. Not a reed, not a paddle, not a canoe in sight. This place used to float, now it just sits. Mainstream historical fact. In the years following the conquest, the Spanish began draining the lakes of the Valley of Mexico. They wanted roads, cities, and livestock grazing lands, not marshes and canals. The vast, interconnected system of chinampas was seen as primitive, inconvenient, so they dismantled it. First, the dikes were breached. Then, canals were diverted. Finally, large-scale draining projects began, turning what had been water gardens into muddy farmland. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate destruction or short-sighted adaptation. Some say the Spanish misunderstood the environmental balance. Others say they knew but didn't care. Either way, the result was the same. The lakes died. Lake Texcoco, once the heart of this floating world, was transformed into dry lake bed and grazing pasture. The canals filled with silt. The fish disappeared. Canoes were replaced with wagons. And the Aztec knowledge of water farming was quietly suffocated under centuries of dust and disinterest. You drift past another old chinampa. This one's barely a shadow of its former self. A stone fence runs along the edge. Sheep graze where maize once grew in orderly rows. There's no sign of flowers, no willows, no laughter. But even here, the roots hold secrets. A fringe theory among environmental historians claims that the Spanish, after witnessing how stubbornly chinampas kept producing, actually borrowed the technique, but only in part. They used the land. Yes, but they stripped it of its ecological logic. They removed the water but kept the shape. And so these fields remained. Confused, half-wet, half-dead. Lacking the system that once made them sing, you pass a crumbling shrine, half sunk into the mud. A single carving remains visible, a flower wrapped in waves. You imagine someone carving it long ago, hoping it might survive, and somehow it has, but the world around it didn't. Or maybe it changed. You stop paddling. Let the canoe spin in place. Around you are ghosts of trees, of gardens, of feasts and songs and floating classrooms. But not all ghosts haunt. Some preserve, some sit quietly beneath the surface, waiting. In this moment, you realize the most tragic part of conquest isn't always the violence. It's the amnesia, the loss of knowing, of method, of how the water should move, how the soil should breathe, how the plants once whispered their growth into the rhythm of the lake. The Spanish didn't just erase the chinampa. They misfiled it. They renamed it. They plowed it flat. But they didn't kill it. Because in the mud beneath your boat, the reeds still remember. And you can't drain out memory. Not completely. The canal you're following narrows again. And for the first time in what feels like forever, the water smells clean. Not fresh exactly, but sweet, like algae and blossoms. Like something slowly remembering how to be alive. You've entered a place that feels less like history, more like memory coming back into focus. Not the old glory, not yet, but something resilient. Something that stayed tucked beneath the surface long enough to begin sprouting again. Because here, scattered among dried beds and grazing paddocks, some chinampas are being rebuilt. It starts small, just a few rectangular plots framed in reeds, mud mounded by hand. But it's unmistakable. A man in a straw hat balances carefully on a narrow chinampa, patting soil into a row. A girl paddles by with a crate of young tomato plants. And overhead, a familiar willow tree, its roots gripping down into the lake bed, as if reclaiming what once was. You're in the 20th century now, yes? That late After centuries of abandonment, neglect, and transformation, some communities near Xochimilco, especially in southern Mexico City, began returning to chinampa farming, not out of nostalgia, out of necessity. Mainstream fact. In the mid-1900s, rapid urban sprawl threatened to erase the last fragments of the chinampa system. But a combination of local activism, environmental crisis, and cultural resurgence sparked a small but persistent movement to revive this ancient method. Why? Because it works. Modern researchers, ecologists, and farmers alike began to realize that chinampas weren't just quaint museum pieces. They were efficient, self-sustaining, low input, capable of high yields without chemicals. And best of all, they restored ecosystems just by existing. Fringe discovery. In recent decades, some biologists noticed that reintroducing chinampas to polluted lake areas cleaned the water naturally. The roots of aquatic plants filtered runoff. While the careful water flow prevented stagnation, the chinampa wasn't just returning, it was healing. You float past a family carefully reinforcing a bed with cut tools. The tools they use aren't stone or obsidian, but the rhythm is the same. Pack the mud, anchor the corners, plant the rows, let the water rise. You watch a young boy, maybe 10, drop a few wriggling fish into a canal. He laughs, not because it's a game, but because it's working. The fish will fertilize the water. The water will feed the roots, and soon, the roots will feed everything else. Historians still debate whether the revived chinampas today are true continuations or modern reconstructions. But maybe that misses the point. Maybe tradition doesn't have to be precise. It just has to persist. You drift farther and notice an old man guiding a group of school children across a canal. He points to the mud, the trees, the rows of chili peppers. His voice is quiet, but the kids are listening, really listening. They're not hearing just instructions. They're hearing a language that almost died. You remember what was lost? The great city, the floating festivals, the classrooms made of reeds and rhythm. But you also see what remains. And maybe, just maybe, what could still grow again. Because the chinampa isn't just soil. It's memory made physical, a pattern, a system, a beat that doesn't stop, even when no one's dancing. And now the world is listening again. Urban farmers in Mexico City have begun rebuilding. Environmental scientists have begun studying. Some culinary circles seek out chinampa-grown produce like treasure because the flavor is different, richer. As if the plants remember how they used to be grown, the path forward isn't perfect. Pollution is still a threat. Land development presses in from all sides. But here, on this narrow stretch of canal, a flower opens, a bean climbs, a root drinks deeply. The lake is coming back. Not as it was, but as it needs to be. You watch the girl from earlier press a chili sprout into the soil. Her fingers are quick, careful. She glances up at you, then down again, already onto the next. This isn't for tourists. It isn't for tradition. It's for survival. And it just might work. The air has changed again, cooler now. As twilight begins to drape itself over the lake like a soft blue cloth, the sky is a muted purple. And the chinampas, once vibrant with midday life, are settling into stillness. You paddle slower now, not out of fatigue, but because the world around you seems to breathe slower. Your canoe glides along a canal that feels older than time. There's a hush to it like this. Part of the lake remembers everything and has finally stopped trying to explain. Ahead, a man stands at the edge of a chinampa, backlit by the fading sun. He's still watching, not you, but the water. The way it ripples, the way it reflects the sky. You realize he's not checking on crops or trees. He's doing something much harder. He's listening to the past. Probably to the stories this place refuses to forget. Because even now, after empire, after conquest, after concrete and pollution, the chinampas still speak. And what they say is simple. We're still here. You pass a narrow chinampa barely wide enough for one row of squash. It looks hand-built, new, but at the far end, there's an ancient willow, half collapsed, but still alive. the new and the old sharing the same muddy pulse. This is what resilience looks like when it stops trying to impress anyone. You begin to notice more signs, stone carvings near roots, faded glyphs scratched into the bark of trees, small bundles of herbs tied with string and tucked under reed mats. Not decoration, memory. Mainstream historical fact. In modern Xochimilco, remnants of pre-Hispanic chinampa construction still exist beneath the soil layers. Archaeologists have found tools, ceramics, and even entire garden beds that match ancient layouts. Beneath every tomato, 1,000 years of decision-making. Beneath every stalk of maize, a whisper of empire. Historians still argue over how much can truly be preserved. Some believe the chinampa is too compromised, its ecological balance lost to urban runoff, climate change, invasive species. Others argue that as long as people keep building, the system can evolve. But here's what no one argues. The chinampa is a philosophy, not just a plot of dirt. It's a way of seeing the world, of accepting that land and water are not enemies. That mud is not failure. That roots can float and still grow deep. You see a man harvesting in silence, not in haste, not with machines, just his hands, the soil, and the setting sun. He wipes sweat from his forehead and smiles at no one in particular. A fringe theory floats through your head. Some researchers suggest that if modern cities adopted chinampa-style modular farming, we could reduce urban heat, clean waterways, and feed populations without sprawling into forests and deserts. It sounds radical, but then again, so did farming on a lake 700 years ago. You paddle a little farther. A flock of birds stirs from a nearby chinampa, lifting into the darkening sky in one graceful spiral. You follow their flight for a while, then let your canoe coast to a stop beside an unplanted plot. It's quiet here. You can almost hear the soil humming. And maybe that's the real lesson. Civilizations rise. Empires fall. Lakes drain. But if even one person keeps planting, keeps weaving reeds, keeps listening to water, the system doesn't die. It just waits. You reach out and touch the edge of the chinampa, soft, damp, real. It's held 1,000 hands before yours. It will hold 1,000 more. You lean back. The sky above is fading. The lake below, deep and dark, still remembers how to float. And so do you. The last rays of sunlight stretch long across the canal. Golden ribbons pulling shadows behind every tree and stalk. Your canoe glides slower now, no effort, no destination, just water and memory. And in this final stretch, something soft begins to settle in your chest. Not sadness, not awe, just stillness. You pass a chinampa bordered with bright orange marigolds, their petals curling at the edges in the cool evening air. A small altar stands in the center, barely knee-high, with a clay bowl of maize and a handful of herbs smoldering in a slow, sweet burn. The smoke rises gently, drawn upward toward the first stars blinking awake above the lake. This is where it all converges. Past, present, future, mud, root, water, the real and the remembered. Mainstream fact. Today, only a tiny fraction of the original chinampa system remains. Most of it lies beneath layers of concrete and highway, buried under the weight of a city that forgot it was once an island. But in Xochimilco and a few surrounding zones, families still maintain floating plots, often using the same techniques their ancestors did. And some of those families, they've passed down unwritten knowledge, things no textbook can hold. Which trees grow fastest in flood season? Which corner gets the earliest frost? How the lake talks before a heavy rain. You pass a woman kneeling beside a shallow trench. She's not planting, she's singing, just a low hum, rhythmic and slow. A lullaby, maybe, or something older. You feel it more than hear it. The fringe idea for tonight? Some ethnoecologists believe chinampas weren't just built, they were grown, shaped slowly through generations of intuitive, intergenerational labor that responded to the land instead of dominating it. There were no blueprints, only memory. And what you floated through all this time wasn't just a farming system. It was a storytelling structure, told in maize, in trees, in water. You look around one last time. There's no applause, no monument, no final drumbeat. Just a small breeze slipping through the willows, a few ducks settling in for the night, and your own quiet breath in rhythm with it all. Because the chinampas never shouted. They whispered, and if you listened closely enough, you'd hear them say, "We never left. We were always here, waiting for you to float back." You press your hand against the canoe's side, fingers damp with lake water. Somewhere behind you, a lantern flickers. Somewhere ahead, more darkness, more quiet, more floating. And you let go of the paddle. Just for now, you let the water carry you. Let the chinampas fade from view now. Let the water grow still beneath you. Your boat drifting into a place without time or urgency. The lake is wide here, and the air has softened. Each breath is slower, each sound quieter. Just the hush of leaves brushing each other overhead, and the faint creak of your canoe resting against the current. There is no need to paddle anymore. You've seen what you came to see, felt what you needed to feel. The gardens are behind you now, but the rhythm of them lingers. That patient, steady sense that life can be built with hands and mud, that the past can hold us gently, that not everything needs to move fast to be strong. Even the stars above seem to move slowly over this part of the world, slow enough that you can feel the planet turning beneath you, slow enough that you can drift without needing to steer. Let yourself settle now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath deepen. Let your mind soften around the edges. The chinampas are quiet now. The crops are sleeping. The water is calm. And you are floating too, not just in a boat, but in memory and story and sleep. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the garden drift into the dark behind your thoughts. You are safe. You are still. And the lake remembers. Good night.